Okay, so welcome back after Colin's last paper, which is talking about linking the paleo data with modern data and with archaeological data. We're going to continue with that theme. So Paul Robb, straight from chairing to presenting the paper. I'll let you finish with your tea.
I'm not going to finish. It's going to be an ongoing saga of tea drinking. Yeah, thank you, Ash, Daryl. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some work I've been doing on East African mountains, and involves a whole range of people. I'm not going to name them because that'll be my 15 minutes. And just as a little bit of an overview of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about mountains from an ecosystem context, and there'll be some issues around sort of climate change and understanding rates and directions and trends of climate change across mountains, and also try and make that link between sort of people and their environment. So certainly I'll present some of the work we've done recently in Tanzania around building sort of social scenarios, and about some of the tools that we've been developing and how we'd like to see those tools develop further across African mountains. So firstly, why ecosystems and why mountains? This is a slide I've used before, but I think it's worth using over and over again, just because it really does sum up why ecosystems are important. It's that connection between land use, between people, and between climate. All of those external drivers really determine the nature and the shape and the composition and the structure of our ecosystems. And those drivers are ultimately responsible for changing the energy, the wood fuel, the charcoal, the water, and that interaction, particularly with carbon dioxide and that link between atmospheric changes and land surface changes. And that can be then encapsulated within this idea of sort of natural capital or ecosystem services. So all of those things that we're interested in, ultimately driven by that interaction between sunlight and plants. So why mountains? Why African mountains? This is just a slide showing three sort of broad sort of conservation schemes. So in the sort of beige colour is the sort of Conservation International Biodiversity hotspots, the sort of WWF eco regions of the world, and the sort of BirdLife International important bird areas. And you can see there's a strong connection into mountain environments from some of these important sort of metrics of conservation. Very much sort of centres of biodiversity richness, rarity, endemism. In terms of people, again, they're very, very important socially. They really are sort of, you know, the water towers of Africa in terms of providing agricultural production, in terms of providing hydropower resources, grazing resources, cooler temperatures, fewer pests, fertile soils, very, very diverse. And this is just a map. It's not a map of mountains, it's a map of population. But you can pick up all the mountain areas. So here we have obviously the Atlas Mountains, the Ethiopian Highlands, the sort of western and eastern Rift Valleys down into sort of Lake Malawi. Down here there's sort of Drakensberg. So again, you can really see how important they are in terms of supporting global African populations. So in the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools and techniques we've been used to understand changes in those mountains. Some of these tools we've already heard about in terms of, some of the sort of sedimentary cores and the historical archives, and increasingly sort of instrumental data. But it's about using these different tools to sense the past, to bring those together to a sort of quite a detailed and nuanced understanding of the present day situation and how people and the environment interact, and then using that understanding to build appropriate futures. And a lot of the talk will be focused on the right-hand side of this slide. So looking at social scenarios, climatic scenarios into the future. I'm not going to read this out, but it's really just to emphasize a little bit of how I'm going to sort of structure the talk, a little bit of a sort of Russian doll type approach, where we're going to zoom in on one mountain and then look at a sort of regional or national sort of picture, and then look at a sort of continental picture in terms of some of the work that we've been doing. And this is just taken largely from an abstract from a paper that's just in the final stages of the review process that Claudia Capitani led. And it's really about trying to tackling those societal and environmental challenges, and how we need to try and develop new approaches, new data, to really sort of be able to understand some of those interactions that are taking place between people and their animals, between people, animals and their environment, and then those drivers of things like fire and climate and changes in seasonality. So we'll start off at the sort of center of the Russian doll, so probably on one of the most iconic of Africa's mountains, Kilimanjaro, where we've got lots of sort of paleo-ecological work has been ongoing. Been working on sites up here, certainly around in the Amboseli Basin, and we'll hear much more about that from Esther later on. But rather than showing lots of sort of wiggly lines showing change through time, we sort of produce these sort of landscape style reconstructions to understand the changes that have occurred over millennia. So this is a 5,000-year reconstruction of that Amboseli ecosystem that is largely fed by the snows of Kilimanjaro. So each day that snow melt snow will melt, go into the groundwater and feed these swamps where we get our paleo records. We can see, again, I'm not going to go into the detail in any of these slides, but we can see that those large transformations have really taken place in the last 500 or so years. And that period when particularly globalization started, the start of the Anthropocene, and again, there's contested debates about that. But arrival of things like exotic crops, so zea maize, the onset of the decimation of the African elephant population through the ivory trade. So all of those drivers are increasingly changing the relationship between people and their environment. Another site just across the border on Mount Shingena on the Pari Mountains. So earlier on we were down in Yozungwa with Andy. Now up on the top of the Eastern Arc Mountains. And again, just to show the value of these sorts of records, sorry about the sort of changing axes, but here we have sort of present day. This is sort of 1,300 years of change from that mountain. And again, we can see really that it's that last sort of few hundred years where you really get these whole scale changes. So what we're sensing today with our sort of modern plot studies and our present day investigations is an atypical relationship of what those ecosystems and the relationship between the ecosystems and their environment. And again, I think that's one of the things that these paleo records really show, is that longer term perspective and how much change has happened in the last few 100 to 500 or so years. So particularly things like the arrival again of maize into the area, the arrival of exotics, the deforestation which has occurred, and the increases of fires particularly associated with that increased presence within the landscape. Okay, so now on to a sort of zooming out a little bit into a sort of Tanzanian perspective, and this is a work that we've really just in the sort of final process of publishing with led by Claudia. It's about understanding change and change in the relationship between people and their environment, about making a link from sort of local perceptions to national narrative. Okay, I shall move on very quickly. But essentially we set scenarios, we understand and capture what people say about change, we then model that, and eventually we produce a map of land use change. So this is our starting point. a map of Tanzania's current land use. It's our lens to look through change. We try and understand what people think is happening to their land and their land use into the future under two scenarios, so a business as usual scenario and a green economy scenario. So under a green economy, there's the population is the same in both, but there is sort of decreased expansion of farmland, there's decreased reliance on natural resources, there is enforced protection of natural resources. Schemes and mechanisms and conservation is efficient rather than inadequate. And we capture all of that information along two gradients of economy and environment. And through a lot of sort of jiggery-pokery that goes on up here, we eventually end up in land use transformation down here. So from forest to cultivation. You can see there's a lot of arrows going to this particular type of land use down the bottom, which is the cultivated land use, but also from forests to woodland, forests to grassland, forests to sort of open forest grassland mosaics. And the output of that process of mixing local people's perceptions of land use change with a modeling phase of how the environment and the economy is driving land use change are these sort of maps of conversion to agriculture for Tanzania towards the year 2025. And as you can see, both a business as usual and a green economy have quite a large amount of red on the map. So that's quite a lot of conversion as the population grows, as those population need to be fed. Of course, they'll continue to convert forests to agricultural land, but there's a lot less within this sort of perspective. And I'm just going to sort of rush through a few of these for the sake of time, but what we're interested in is the relationship between these changes and biodiversity. So things like here we can see the biodiversity for all of these four main groups, the primates, the amphibians, the birds, and reptiles. And we can then look at our maps of land use change under these different scenarios and see how that potentially could impact on their distribution and how that distribution could be impacted as climate change starts to impact on their distributions. And we heard from Colin about what a strong impact climate is having on some of these distributions. But certainly land use is a very, very pervasive driver of change, which we need to be able to account for. In the last 2 minutes, I shall talk a little bit about some of the sort of the broad scale. So this is the African scale thing, where we've been largely looking at sort of three main areas. So climate change, land use change, and population change across African mountains. So this is a data set that Phil Platts produced and due for an AfriClim 4 upgrade over the summer. But essentially we've gone from these large global projections of climate change to very fine scale projections for the whole of the African continent, sort of 1 kilometer grid cells. And these things are freely available. And obviously at 1 kilometer, you can start to look at the impact of climate change within a mountain environment. As Andy showed earlier on, mountains are characterized by these very, very steep gradients of change. So obviously having a grid cell of 250 kilometers, which is a global climate model grid cell, isn't particularly useful in terms of understanding what change may occur into the future. So we need these higher resolution forecasts. And just to give an idea what they look like, so these are changes from the present to the mid so 2050, and changes from the present to the end of the century for temperature. And obviously in a warming world, mountains are going to get warmer, but it's not a constant figure by any stretch of the imagination. So obviously there's more warming towards the Atlas than down in the Southern Cape. But obviously there are going to be changes in precipitation, which are some of the much more pervasive changes. So again, changes from the present to the mid-2050s to the end of the 21st century. Some areas are projected to get wetter, other areas are projected to get drier. And again, that's going to have a very strong impact in terms of species distributions, in terms of the productivity of land, the relationship between people and their land. We can also look at things like changes in seasonality. So it's maybe not the annual temperature, moisture, which is important, but more the intensity of the dry season, which again is something which we can do with this new data which is being produced. Population change, of course, is a very strong and pervasive change, and particularly in East Africa. So this is just the last 5 years of change, and we can see there's a massive change and growth of population within the Ethiopian highlands, within some of the, particularly along the sort of rift valleys. So again, focused largely in mountain areas. Similarly with land cover change, lots of land cover change occurring. This is just sort of over 10 years between sort of 2001, 2009, again from the MODIS data that Colin was talking about earlier on. Significant changes occurring within land use. So our last slide is talking a little bit about the use of these data. And I think obviously this afternoon it'd be great to have some feedback and discussion about how not just these, but all of the data we've been hearing about can be used. There's a workshop coming up in a couple of weeks, supported by the World Universities Network, where again we'll be looking at these types of data and about developing projects around African mountains. But we can also looking at impacts of policy and how policies are achieving conservation goals, some of the trade-offs which occur, some of the systems that can be put in place to try and adapt to climate change, to try and adapt to some of the land use and the population changes which are occurring. And I think I should leave it there. Yeah. Thank you.
So any questions for Rob? Seems unlikely.
Oh, seems unlikely.
It seems unlikely that they're woke again.
I have a very specific one before I get the next one set up.
Okay.
You have a date of 1810 AD for the introduction to maize.
Yeah.
What's that from? Is that from pollen or like
yes, so it's we can identify maize pollen as a type.
Yeah.
And maize is very interesting because today it's probably one of the most